SB 1070, is it necessary in the face of a recalcitrant federal government?
You know, how long are you going to talk about securing the border, protecting the American people? How long? You know, I'm just tired of that malfeasance or misfeasance on the part of government not doing their job.
Or is it unworkable in a diverse society?
The people in this state that are opposed to it, and particularly in the Latino community, to them this issue is personal.
Arizona gets its day in court, the U.S. Supreme Court. A preview tonight on Arizona Week.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support. Once again, your moderator, Michael Chiha.
The Supreme Court next week will hear arguments on Arizona's historic immigration control law. We're setting the stage tonight for the hearing with constitutional experts and two key protagonists. First, Arizona State University law professor Carissa Byrne-Hessick, who has studied SB 1070. You and several colleagues co-wrote a paper on SB 1070 last year. Tell us what the genesis of that paper was.
Well, there were a number of us here in the state, myself at Arizona State Law School and a couple of folks that I know at the University of Arizona Law School, who kept getting a lot of questions right after SB 1070 got signed into law about, you know, what was the content of the law, what were the legal issues, and one of the professors down at the University of Arizona came up with a great idea of a bunch of us getting together and writing a paper that didn't really take a stand on whether it was a good law or a bad law, just described what the law did and explained what legal issues were raised by the enactment of the law.
And the paper's title calls SB 1070, quote, a legal labyrinth.
That's right. Well, it's a law that that first of all encompasses quite a bit of substance. It has a number of sections that do a number of different things. But it also, like a labyrinth or a maze, can be really confusing, certainly to lawyers, and I would assume then obviously to non-lawyers, to try to figure out not just what the law does, but what exactly the legal questions are that it raises. It's actually not easy to read the law and figure out exactly how it would be applied and what the legal challenges would be to it.
Let's go through the key points that you and your colleagues brought up in this paper. First, race and civil rights. What are the legal implications that you found regarding race and civil rights with SB 1070?
Well, so we thought this was a particularly important issue. It ends up that this didn't really come up in the lawsuit that the United States filed against Arizona, so it's actually not going to be discussed really before the U.S. Supreme Court. But at the time the law was enacted, this was the question that people were getting most often. What are the race and civil rights implications of this law? The United States government, I think, was very strategic in the challenge that they brought. They brought a challenge saying, look, certain aspects of SB 1070 infringe on the powers of the federal government. And racial profiling isn't one issue that sort of falls under that big umbrella.
Now, to some of the issues that the federal government is challenging in regard to SB 1070, the security issue, which you and your colleagues identified, what were the key issues there?
So the law enforcement factor that I think is most interesting is the idea that SB 1070 doesn't just tell law enforcement what to do, but it actually tells citizens that if they think law enforcement isn't enforcing the law to its fullest extent, that they can bring a lawsuit suing the local entity that isn't sort of being strong enough in their enforcement. So in some ways, I think that's the part of SB 1070 that's most innovative or broadest when it comes to law enforcement issues.
And then the other issue, which is probably at the heart of the case before the Supreme Court, the preemption issue, or the federal versus state sovereignty issue. What are the key points to be made there?
So the preemption issue here is, I think, a really complicated issue, and it's a question that underlies each of the four provisions that have been enjoined preliminarily. And the strength of that argument for the United States, I think, sort of ebbs and flows depending on which of the sections that they're talking about. The United States has a very strong argument that the registration section of SB 1070, the one that creates state law penalties for failing to comply with federal laws about registration and registration documents, the United States probably has a really, really strong argument there based on something called field preemption, and we can talk specific preemption if you want to. But then a much harder argument when it comes to, for example, the section involving whether law enforcement officers can make warrantless arrests when someone's removable or has committed a removable offense. Their preemption argument isn't nearly as strong.
Finally, there's a foreign relations component to this. You make the case with your colleagues in the paper that foreign relations are an exclusive matter of federal purview, yet a law like this has foreign relations implications. So constitutionally speaking, where's the government in that?
So that's actually a really interesting argument that the United States is making in this lawsuit. They're making the argument that if Arizona enacts this law, even if the law is criminalizing the same things that the federal government has already criminalized, by setting its own enforcement agenda, so by deciding how many people it's going to arrest, under what circumstances it's going to arrest them, whether it's going to prioritize people who are here illegally and that's the only thing that they've done contrary to law, or if they're going to go after people who are both here illegally and have committed, say, for example, violent crimes. All of those questions are tied up in what criminal justice lawyers would call prosecutorial discretion, right? Every day, prosecutors have to decide what cases they're going to prioritize and what cases they're going to let go. So obviously, prosecutors are going to prioritize, for example, murder prosecutions and let a lot of jaywalking prosecutions go. The federal government's making a similar argument about their prosecutorial discretion with respect to immigration enforcement, and they're saying that those judgments, right, their decision about how stringently to enforce immigration laws, that's affected by foreign relation concerns.
What will the Supreme Court zero in on as it considers SB 1070's constitutionality? Here's University of Arizona Regents Professor Tony Massaro to tell us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
What do you expect the focal point of the Supreme Court to be on Wednesday when it takes this case up?
Well, based on the briefs and the discussions leading up to the case, it seems clear they're going to focus on preemption. And if I could simplify, the heart of the Arizona's case with respect to this is that what we've done here is nothing other than a form of cooperative federalism. We're responsible for cooperating and communicating with the federal government with respect to immigration policy, and that's exactly what they will argue that they've done here, that they threaded the needle. They're also going to argue that there's a disparate impact on the state of Arizona with respect to immigration policy, and that what they're doing here is attempting to step in where the federal government has defaulted.
And the federal argument will be preemption. First, for our viewers, explain that briefly. What is the constitutional premise of preemption? The
original framers understood that when they set up, they said they split the atom of sovereignty, that we have state governments and then this, at that time, new centralized federal government. Well, it wasn't entirely new, but reconstituted under the Constitution that we now have. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution makes crystal clear that where the federal government has legislated in an area of its legitimate authority, if there's an implied or express conflict with state law, if the state attempts to legislate on the same topic, we had to figure out what trumps what. And the Supremacy Clause gives the following answer: federal trumps state, provided that the federal government is in a legitimate sphere of its own authority.
So on that basis, how strong is the federal government's preemption argument in this case?
Well, they won below, and but not with respect to all of SB 1070, but 4 provisions in particular that Judge Bolton and then the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals looked at. And they analyzed the arguments for and against preemption as applied to those specific provisions. Preemption law is actually quite sophisticated and particularized. It's highly context specific. And so the question is whether, as the federal government has argued, what Arizona has done with respect to these 4 provisions creates an impermissible kind of a patchwork, that you can't have national policy in an area like this that's indisputably given to the federal government interrupted by conflicting or obstacle forms of local policy or state policy. And
now, of course, as you said, the state is arguing that this really isn't preemption, it's just enhancement.
That's right.
How strong is that argument?
Well, we'll see. It'll be as strong as the United States Supreme Court decides that it is. In the last several years, this court has taken quite a few preemption cases, and in a significant number of them, they've ruled in favor of the federal government. That is, they've concluded that it's a legitimate area for government control and that it is important enough national interest that it divested the states of conflicting control. First, they'll have to determine whether the state is right in saying there isn't a conflict, that this is what they call cooperative federalism. And the state's arguing they're merely mirroring federal law. I think the federal government will say you're not merely mirroring, you're magnifying. You're distorting, you're interfering with executive discretion, that there are spillover effects with respect to international relations and other issues that the federal government is arguing make this a step beyond what the states legitimately should be engaged in with respect to the sensitive matter of national policy.
What should Arizonans look for next week when the court is hearing the arguments in the way of posturing, questions from the court, and then what happens after that? We have about a minute remaining.
One thing that they will be interested in is the absence of Justice Kagan. Justice Kagan is the former Solicitor General of the United States, the country's lawyer. She's recused herself. So it's going to be up to 8 justices instead of 9 justices. Oral arguments are the opportunity for the court, members of the court, to ask questions about things that are particularly troubling to them. And sophisticated observers always pay close attention to the nature of those questions. If the lawyers don't satisfactorily answer those questions, however, it doesn't mean that the judges and their clerks might not supplement those answers, not with evidence beyond the record, but looking to the briefs, and there are quite a few of them filed in this case. So I think we'll learn something about federalism. I think we'll learn something about preemption. And I think we will learn something about the issues in this complicated case. But I don't think at the end of it we're going to be able to predict the outcome.
Regents Professor Tony Massaro of the University of Arizona College of Law, thanks for being with me.
Thanks for having me.
Constitutional issues aren't the only factors behind the law. The politics are intense, driven by key protagonists' personalities. Here's SB 1070 author and former state senator Russell Pearce. Now, SB 1070 passed in 2010 by the Arizona legislature. You introduced it, you wrote it, worked it through the legislature. Tell us the background of it. How long had you been working on this legislation?
You know, I've been in this battle for way over a quarter of a century. Most of my life has been in public safety and law enforcement. 23 years in Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, including as chief deputy. I've always had a passion for justice, and laws without consequences are no laws at all. You have to enforce them. I've watched the damage to America through our failures, through government's failure to do its job. There comes a point you say, enough's enough. Go fix the problem. It's like the border. How many years have we been talking about the border? We know the federal government can secure borders. They're doing it all over the world, but not here. You know, how long are you going to talk about securing the border, protecting the American people? How long? You know, I'm just tired of that malfeasance or misfeasance on the part of government not doing their job. Is it okay for folks to break into our country illegally and then take American jobs? Is it okay for a business to compete immorally and unfairly and illegally against the honest businessman down the street who can't compete because he had that disadvantage, that competitive disadvantage, because he follows the law? The crime that comes with it?
Have we seen specific results from the passage of it?
And yes, and very empirical data. Phoenix Law Enforcement Association in September of 2011 put out a press release, and they said because of SB 1070, I'm going to paraphrase, but fairly close to their exact words, because of SB 1070, they've got an unprecedented low in crime, a 30-year low in crime. They said they have 600 police vacancies, old police strategies, budget cuts, and other challenges, nothing has made the difference except SB 1070.
Now, we're seeing crime reduced, especially violent crime, all across the country where there's not SB 1070.
Right. But Arizona, violent crime rate has dropped 3 times that of the national average.
What is your definition of a secure border? What would satisfy you from the federal level as far as securing Arizona's border?
You know, it's not hard. You know, in Yuma sector, they put up a fence with some technology and lighting and almost have stopped the illegal entries along that area. San Diego, they've done the same thing, almost stopped the entries of illegal entries at that point. You know, it's obvious what has to be done. I want folks to come through our port of entry. No other way. Secure the border.
So if that's happening in the Yuma and San Diego sectors, why isn't it happening in the Tucson sector?
Because your federal government has failed to do anything about it.
But they've done it elsewhere.
A couple of small pilot projects that worked. They promised a fence, they funded a fence, and then decided not to do it. They talk about border security, but really don't go after it. You got this president who throws out the red carpet and the green light. He just released 300,000 illegal aliens that were in custody. He refused to deport them. Set new policies for deportation. Working on a DREAM Act. I mean, why would they not continue to come when you're making promises? Get across the border illegally and we'll reward you. Free stuff, free education, free health care, and we'll put handcuffs on law enforcement. Just like they're doing. They're sued as the federal government. This president, as far as I know, the only president in the history of the United States to have taken sides with a foreign government to sue its own citizens on enforcing the law, simply enforcing the law.
These issues have been building for decades, though, as you pointed out, through administrations in both political parties.
In both parties.
And in fact, the problem got really bad in the last decade, which was a Republican administration, Republican control of Congress. What happened there?
Well, same thing. You've got 2 groups that have joined hands on the backside of this issue, which would never be aligned. You know, you've got the open border crowd who wants cheap votes. It's all part of corruption. You got the cheap labor crowd. I call them prophets over patriotism, who simply want cheap labor while they ignore the cost to America. And these K Street lobbyists in Washington, D.C. seem to have a stranglehold on Congress and the presidency, which is a shame. But when you talk about both parties, and I pull no punches, I was offended at either party who would reward lawbreakers over lawkeepers while they're ignoring the damage to this republic.
Is American immigration policy applying artificial limits on what should be a free market opportunity?
Free market is not criminals. You know, the free market doesn't allow someone to break into your house and take stuff because then it allows you to buy more stuff. That's not the kind of spur you want in the economy. Right. You know, and Heritage Foundation, which I think is one of the most premier research organizations in America, say those groups that are breaking in, those immigrants and illegals, use social services at 3 to 4 times out of any other demographic. So there's a cost to that. It's not cheap labor. That's cheap labor only to the guy that doesn't recognize. You want to really let the free market work? Well, you let it work within the bounds, like Ronald Reagan said. A nation that loses control of its border will soon no longer be a nation.
Last winter, during the agricultural season in Yuma, fields went unharvested because they couldn't get enough workers in the fields to harvest. American unemployment at a 26-year high. Why weren't Americans going there to do that work?
If there's ever an area that we probably have, or at least I have sensitivity to, it's probably the agribusiness. And I agree. But it's partly our fault again there, too. We're raising kids today that don't know how to pull the rope on a Briggs & Stratton engine. You know? They immediately want to graduate in college to be the CEO of a company. They're not into, you know, actually working where you break into a sweat. Well, you know what? You let the market work, but you pay an American the right wage, though there's not a job they won't do.
Next week, the day before the Supreme Court hears SB 1070, you'll be in Washington testifying in the U.S. Senate before a committee. What do you expect to be asked there, and what do you expect you'll be saying to the Senate committee?
Well, first of all, I'll certainly defend the constitutionality of SB 1070. And it was the same argument I say employers saying, I predict a win before the United States Supreme Court. Congress has the sole responsibility of regulation. States that have been codified by the courts for years and years and years, states, even when it's an exclusive duty of the federal government, have a right to further their intent. And that's what SB 1070 does. So I will make sure that I talk about the constitutionality of it. I will make sure I talk about what led You know, depending on the time, you don't really know what time they'll give you. But I'll make it clear what led us to SB 10 and the need for it.
And finally, Congressman Raul Grijalva, who co-chairs the Congressional Progressive Caucus. You've called SB 1070 bad legislation. Would you tell us what the gist of that argument is for you?
Well, part of the gist is going to be before the Supreme Court on the 25th. The fundamental constitutionality, the supremacy clause that's in the Constitution, and the right of the federal government to set foreign policy and immigration policy. The framers put that very clearly because they understood that that had to be a national perspective. So that's bad policy being the constitutionality. There's other issues to it as well. The racial profiling, opening up a Pandora's box on suspicion, opening up a Pandora's box based on how you look, how you speak, what language you speak, and making that a criteria for suspicion. That is an important factor. But I think if you look at it structurally, at what it does to a society, I don't question the fact that this immigration system of ours is broken. It's dysfunctional. It's been dysfunctional for a decade and a half. And you have to deal with it, but it has to be done comprehensively.
So you think there is validity in the fact that we have an immigration system that doesn't work for us?
Across the whole spectrum, politically on this issue, we agree on that point. And it is the solution, and it is the strategy to deal with that broken system. That's where the division is, and that's where the debate is. Some people, Senator Pearce's legislation, former Senator Pearce's legislation, and the one Jan Brewer signed, the ones that are going on in other parts of the country, they went at that issue in a very punitive, violating basic constitutional rights, and making a person's appearance, language, background a criteria for suspicion. The people in this state that are opposed to it, and particularly in the Latino community, to them this issue is personal. The vast majority are not undocumented. The vast majority are immigrants, legal, citizens, 1 to 10 generations in this state of ours. They take this issue personally because the affront is at a class of people. That's what this legislation opened up. And now that we have this division, the Supreme Court's decision is critical because if they make SB 1070 the law of the land, then I think we're in for a difficult time on a social, societal level, and a difficult times in terms of relations per se in this country overall.
One of the issues that the other side talks about in relation to this is the need for a secure border. Do you acknowledge we need to do a better job of securing the border?
As we went through this process, Michael, I learned a lot, and I also think I compromised a lot. And the bill that I supported, that I still support, big component of it was border security in terms of enforcement, in terms of the personnel issue with Border Patrol and Customs, in terms of the security issue being, that was one pillar. The other pillar was path to legalization, and the other pillar was family unification. Those were the 3 pillars, and all of them. And so it's not conceding the point, but if we want to solve this very important national issue, and border security is part of that issue, then you've got to incorporate it and make it a prominent part of the reform.
So what does a secure border look like to you in a way that would allow the rest of the conversation to occur?
That is the $64 million question that has been, we have perpetually asked, at what point? You know, under Obama, we have a record number of deportations. Under Obama, we have a record number of apprehensions. Under Obama, you have a record number of worksite enforcement. 5 to 6 times more Border Patrol agents on the border than there were prior to him. So that, you can't say there hasn't been an enforcement strategy on the part of this administration. And so at what point, what triggers the other part of the discussion? That question is posed constantly. Will people that get up, We will not do anything until the border is secure. The follow-up question is, what would trigger the rest of the discussion? There's yet to be an answer. Because I think it's a question without an answer.
Is there any legislation in the works anywhere in Congress to deal with any aspect of this right now that has a chance?
I don't think so. I think the legislation we're probably going to see will be employer sanctions, a more robust E-Verify, a rotating guest worker program. But to deal with the issues of family unification and the 8 to 11 million people that are here undocumented in this country, no, not really.
The supporters of SB 1070 say that the DREAM Act, path to citizenship, any of those actions only tend to encourage more illegal immigration. Is that correct?
I really believe, and I went around this issue with people, and there's good debate on the other side about that. But the reality is, once we stabilize what we have now, once we have a commitment as to what workforce needs will be in the future, then the issues of enforcement, who gets permits, who does that, becomes more clarified. Right now, there is a morass of not knowing what is going on.
In the wake of SB 1070's passage a couple of years ago, you were among those who led the call for an economic boycott of Arizona, and then you backed away from that after that. Could you tell us first, what was your motivation in making that call, and then why did you make a change in that?
The issue was, to me, a very direct issue, that we couldn't allow SB 1070 to be this localized, peculiar little law in this peculiar state of Arizona, that it had to be nationalized, and the debate had to be taken to a bigger level. And so that was part of the motivation, to make it a bigger issue than just Arizona. The reason for backing away, quite fundamentally, it wasn't having any effect.
My complete unedited interviews with Hessek, Pearce, and Grijalva are on our website, azweek.com. Also there, you'll find a number of the research documents referred to in this evening's program, compiled for us by reporter-intern Amir Talib. Arizona Public Media will have extensive coverage of the SB 1070 arguments all next week, both on NPR 89.1 and Arizona Illustrated. That's our program for Friday, April 20th, 2012. For Arizona Week, I'm Michael Cheetah.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.